We're going to continue in Isaiah chapter 37, and hopefully we'll get through the rest of this chapter. It's all pretty straightforward. We ended last week with Hezekiah's prayer when he heard the threats and the tauntings from the Rabshakeh. He then began praying. So what we're going to see next is we're going to see the fact that God heard his prayers and heard all the prayers, and he's actually going to answer them. So starting up in verse 21, it says, "Then Isaiah the son of Amos sent unto Hezekiah, saying, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, whereas thou hast prayed to me against Sennacherib, king of Assyria." So we've been going back and forth between 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, and we see that all the history of these events are recorded. And yet again, we have a connection here, verse 21, and we can go back and look at 2 Kings chapter 19. And we have the same thing being recorded. It says, "Then Isaiah the son of Amos sent to Hezekiah, saying, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, that which thou hast prayed to me against Sennacherib, king of Assyria, it says, I have heard." So we touched a little bit last week about prayers of the righteous and how God hears the prayers of the righteous. And we have this very event taking place and documented that God hears the prayers of his people. Not only does he hear the prayers of his people, but God answers those prayers. So we can look at the next couple verses here. It says, "This is the word which the Lord hath spoken concerning him." It says, "The virgin, the daughter of Zion, hath despised thee, and laughed thee to scorn. The daughter of Jerusalem hath shaken her head at thee." Verse 23, "Whom hast thou reproached and blasphemed? And against whom hast thou exalted thy voice, and lifted up thine eyes on high, even against the Holy One of Israel?" So we can see here in verse 22, all the things that Sennacherib had planned, well, they were about to get reversed. The people were praying to God. Hezekiah, Isaiah, praying to God. God heard their prayers. God's going to answer their prayers. The things that Sennacherib had planned, the whole taking over Jerusalem, all of that is basically going to get reversed. It's not going to happen. And then in verse 23, we can see that all of this blasphemy, all of what was said, every bit of it was against the Holy One of Israel. All of what Sennacherib was doing and saying and taunting, mocking, deceiving, manipulating, every bit of that was going against God. Now, Sennacherib obviously didn't believe in God. He had all of his idols that he believed in, but the end result is he was sinning against the Holy One of Israel. He was sinning against God. So basically, verse 23 is pointing that out, that they've blasphemed. God sees it, and God's going to deal with it because they sinned against the Holy One. So it goes on to say, "By thy servants hast thou reproached the Lord, and hast said, By the multitude of my chariots am I come up to the height of the mountains, to the sides of Lebanon, and I will cut down the tall cedars thereof, and the choice fir trees thereof, and I will enter into the height of his border, and the forest of his Carmel." I have digged and drunk water, and with the sole of my feet have I dried up all the rivers and besieged places. So let's stop here and think about verse 24 a little bit. So in verse 24, we have all these boasts that Sennacherib is saying. You know, all of this paints the picture of there's nothing to stand against me. I will do what I want. He says, the height of the mountains, my chariots came up to, the sides of Lebanon. He says, I'll cut down the tall cedars thereof. There's nothing standing in my way. If I come about a forest, I'll cut it down. I'll keep on going. I will fulfill my plans, is what Sennacherib is trying to say. And all of this is boasting. And that's exactly what verse 24 represents. The idle boasts of King Sennacherib. The things that he was spouting out and thinking that his false gods and his idols were on his side and he was all powerful. And all along he's going up against the Lord of hosts, the God of heaven. So according to Sennacherib, nothing could stop his conquest. He's got his eyes on Jerusalem. He's saying there's nothing in this world that's going to stop me from going over there and taking over that city. It was God's power. So let's think about that. Let's think about how God's people were being punished. So they were being punished because they wanted to be like the other nations. So just like many other judgments, God allowed these heathen nations to come in, and they would be used as a tool to inflict the punishment on the people of God for not listening. So Assyria was no different. God allowed Assyria to come down and inflict the punishment that Moses warned them about. And Sennacherib, just like Nebuchadnezzar, just like the Pharaoh, all of that went to their head, and they thought, look what I did. Look at my power. And Sennacherib's no different when he subdued these nations. And little did he know, God allowed him to do that because there were purposes for the people of Israel, and that they were going to be punished for not listening to God and following his commandments. So when we look at this and we go down into verse 27, we see that which God purposes will be done. So we had the idle boasts that Sennacherib was saying. And then in verse 27 it says, therefore their inhabitants were of small power, they were dismayed and confounded. They were as the grass of the field, as the green herb, as the grass on the housetops, and as corn blasted before it be grown up. So let's think about this. So let's think about that which God purposes will be done. Now, this is where we can get a little confused when we see the people of God being punished and having these heathen nations come in and basically go to battle and destroy their land, all that they worked hard for. And you may think, man, why is that? You know, how did they overcome the people of God? Well, the thing is, they were warned about all this. They were warned from Moses what was going to happen if they didn't listen. There'd be consequences. So here we have the Assyrian nation coming in, and they're taking over. So this goes back to God's purposes. So a question for you guys is it possible for a heathen nation to play a part in God's purposes? And I've pretty much answered that, but So I'm seeing some head shakes of yes.
Well, you think back to Egypt.
That's right. You had the Egyptian bondage. They were in slavery. Now we're talking about the Assyrians coming in, Assyrian captivity. After this, we've got Babylonian captivity. All the way into the first century, we have the Romans destroying the city of Jerusalem. So it's not abnormal for God to use heathen nations to play a part in whatever punishments need to take place for their disobedience. So speaking of what Moses taught on, Moses warned Israel that punishment was going to be a result of their disobedience. So let's turn to Deuteronomy and let's see what Moses talked about here in Deuteronomy chapter 28. And I hope I got the right verses jotted down. Let's see, starting in verse 47. Deuteronomy 28, verse 47 says, "Because thou servest not the Lord thy God with joyfulness and with gladness of heart for the abundance of all things, therefore shalt thou serve thine enemies, which the Lord shall send against thee, in hunger and in thirst and in nakedness and in want of all things, and he shall put a yoke of iron upon thy neck, until he have destroyed thee." And then the next couple verses, "The Lord shall bring a nation against thee from far and from the end of the earth, as swift as an eagle flieth, the nations whose tongue thou shalt not understand, a nation of fierce countenance, which shall not regard the person of the old, nor show favor to the young." So, all of this was part of the warnings that Moses laid out for the people, telling them, if you do not listen to all the things that I just laid out before you, the outcome is going to end up being these foreign nations are going to come into your beautiful land, and they're going to destroy it. You're going to end up serving them in a captivity. Things are going to be bad. And yet, here we have the people. They didn't listen anyway. And here they face Assyrian captivity. They're going to face Babylonian captivity because they didn't heed to the warnings. So we have all this documented back in the book of Deuteronomy by Moses. And then it goes on to say, in verse 28 and 29, it says, "But I know thy abode, and thy going out, and thy coming in, and thy rage against me. Because thy rage against me and thy tumult is come up into mine ears, therefore will I put my hook in thy nose, and my bridle in thy lips, and I will turn thee back by the way which thou camest." So, let's think about that. First off, we can see through all these events that nothing is hidden from the Lord. So Hezekiah sent people to Isaiah to pray on their behalf of what's happening. Hezekiah's praying on what's happening. He wants to make sure God knows what is happening, what Sennacherib is doing. And what we can see from all of this is the fact that God did know. He does see all. Nothing is going to be hidden from God. He sees what's happening here. So, basically now, we're going to get into the arrogance of the king of Assyria is going to be punished. He's not going to be victorious. Matter of fact, he's not going to defeat that which the Lord has in place. All the decrees that Sennacherib tried to put in place, they're not going to be successful. And basically, Isaiah is trying to relay this to Hezekiah to give him comfort that the remnant of those who faithfully follow God are not going to be defeated by Sennacherib. They're not going to be defeated by the words that the Rabshakeh is coming down and saying. None of this is going to be victorious. So, moving on, it continues. Now we have the Lord's sign. So in verse 30 and 31 it says, "And this shall be a sign unto thee. Ye shall eat this year such as groweth of itself, and the second year that which springeth of the same. And in the third year sow ye and reap and plant vineyards and eat the fruit thereof. And the remnant that is escaped of the house of Judah shall again take root downward and bear fruit upward." So let's think about this. So we just got through looking at the taunts, the fact that God sees all of this, and the fact in verse 29, he sees the rage of Sennacherib. He sees all the things he hears all the things being said, and it says, "I will turn thee back by the way which thou camest." Okay? So all of this is being relayed to Hezekiah through Isaiah. All of this. And here we have in verse 30 and 31, basically what we have is a hope. Okay? We have a hope for the remnant. God sees what's happening. He's not going to let it happen. In the third year ye sow and reap and plant vineyards and eat fruit thereof. Things are going to get back to being productive and fruitful for the people. The remnant that is escaped from that captivity and the battles of the house of Judah, they are again going to take root downward and bear fruit upward. They're going to get through this. Their population will be regenerated once again. They're going through the punishments of what they decided to do and going against the commandments that Moses laid out. So the people are dealing with the consequences. God is saying, look, there's an escape. Things are going to get better. Stay faithful. You'll be able to build up your society again, your vineyards and your fruit, all of that. It's going to come back. Hang in there, is what he's saying. So in verse 32, it says, "For out of Jerusalem shall go forth a remnant, and they that escape out of Mount Zion, the zeal of the Lord of hosts shall do this." So, you know, when you look at verses like this and you see the hope of the remnant, and then in verse 32, you read about the remnant yet again going forth and that they will escape. You know, for us today, it should give us full assurance in knowing that if we live our lives according to the commandments that are laid out, we can have full assurance that in the end, God's going to take care of us. We will, when we leave this earth, have that assurance of being in heaven with God one day. The remnant, the faithful group, God's not going to abandon us. He didn't abandon them either. It says they're going to escape, and none of the things of the heathen nations is going to be successful and victorious. That ultimately, if you're on God's side, you have your faith in God, you have your shield and your protector, and nothing's going to stand up against that. So, all of this is a sign that's being laid out that Isaiah is relaying to give hope and assurance for the people that this mere man Sennacherib is not going to do anything to hinder the purposes of God. So here we have the Lord's defending of Jerusalem. So in verses 33 through 35, it says, "Thus saith the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into this city, nor shoot an arrow there, nor come before with the shields, nor cast a bank against it." So here we have it laid out even further in detail. Sennacherib is not going to enter into Jerusalem and take it over. All of what Rabshakeh said, Isaiah is trying to relay, look, the Lord is going to protect you. Sennacherib's going to end up going back to his home place. Don't worry about it. God's going to shield his people. In verse 34, it says, "By the way that he came, by the same shall he return, and shall not come into this city, saith the Lord. For I will defend this city to save it for mine own sake and for my servant David's sake." So let's think about that. I've got some notes here I was going to share if I can find them. Let's see, verses 33 and 34. So we have the assurance of Hezekiah and the people of Jerusalem will be spared. Let's see here, verse 35. Okay, yeah. So verse 35. So it says, "For I will defend this city to save it." And then the next part of the verse here is pretty critical. It says, "For mine own sake." For my servant David's sake. So, basically, when you go back, I've got a note here, when you go back to 2 Samuel chapter 7, and you think about the state of the city and all what's going on, you know, there was a promise here and a commitment to David, if I can ever make it there. 2 Samuel chapter 7. Because you can really skip over the last part of this verse and not put a lot of thought into it. But when it says, "For mine own sake," and for my servant David's sake. So there must be some significance in David being mentioned here. So let's see here. 2 Samuel chapter 7 and starting in verse 12. Starting in verse 12. So let's see here. It says, "And when thy days be fulfilled, and thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build an house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he commit iniquity, I shall chasten him, and with the rod of men, and with the stripes of the children of men. But my mercy shall not depart away from him, as I look it from Saul, whom I put away before thee, and thine house and thy kingdom shall be established forever before thee, thy throne shall be established forever. According to all these words, and according to all the vision, so did Nathan speak unto David." So when you look at David, and you look at all the, I guess when you look at the promise that was made for David and his kingdom, and you look at what's being talked about here, that the city is going to be saved, which would be the city of David, for mine own sake. So for the Lord's sake, it's going to be saved. And for the sake of David, it's going to be saved. Because there were some promises made to David concerning, I guess, his city or that kingdom. And obviously, God had plans for Jerusalem, the city of David. And we know that it was in Jerusalem that God put his name, so that when all the world looked at Jerusalem, they knew that that was a place that God put his name. So all of this and defending Jerusalem and saving it, all of this plays a part into the ultimate plan of what God truly has purposed for this world. And he saved it for his sake, for his glory, and he saved it for the sake of David and the covenant that was made there and the promise. And did you have something? You made a face.
You made a promise, you also gave him a warning too in verse 14. If you commit iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the stripes of the children of men. So that would be like a nation coming to punish them sent by the Lord.
Yeah, and that would go right along with Assyrian captivity, Babylonian captivity. And really, when you want to go even deeper into it, I mean, that's what happened in the first century when the Romans ended up coming and punishing Jerusalem for all of how they were acting. So yeah, that's yet another instance of where God will use these other nations to come in and place punishment for when his people are not living obedient. See if I had anything else on that. I don't think so. Did anybody else have anything dealing with David and promises that would have been made? If not, we'll continue on here. So, again, we're having the hope laid out. We're having the fact that Sennacherib's not going to come in and do all of what the Rabshakeh said he was going to do. And now we have the Assyrians' destruction. So in verses 36, 37, and 38, it says, Then the angel of the Lord went forth and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 180,500. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. So Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, departed and went and returned and dwelt at Nineveh. And it came to pass, as he was worshiping in the house of Nisroch his god, that Adramelech and Sharezer his son smote him with the sword, and they escaped into the land of Armenia, and Esarhaddon his son reigned in his stead. So, just a little bit ago, we read that he would, let's see here, what verse was that? Yeah, in verse 29. And I will turn thee back by the way which thou camest. So all of this is laid out in the book of 2 Kings. And as we see here in verse 38, or verse 37 and 38, he did indeed return. He went back where he came from. And we see in verse 38 that he was actually assassinated. And we can read in 2 Kings that he was assassinated by his own children when he returned. So, 2 Kings chapter 19 and verse 35, again, it has this whole account laid out. It says, And it came to pass that night that the angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 180,500. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. The Assyrians' destruction. They went up against God. They came in, they were violent, wicked, and God was not going to accept that. He was not going to put up with that. So they were destroyed.
You can go to sleep alive and wake up.
Yeah, that's very true. Thinking I had something else along those lines without us actually having to read 2 Kings, but so just mark it down to get fuller detail on the events that took place. I would make note that you can go back 2 Kings chapter 18 and chapter 19, 2 Chronicles chapter 32. All of those events are laid out in what we've been studying so far throughout chapter 37 and actually in chapter 36. Everything's going hand in hand. And let's see here. So when you look at this entire section that we just went through, and we look at the prayer that was being made through this section. So basically, they were praying in a time of disaster that was taking place in the land. And they had enough faith and assurance to know that when they prayed to God, God was going to hear them. And as a bit of an outline here, and I'll just go through these notes so we can go back and pick up the events that we just studied here in chapter 37. So when Hezekiah heard the threat that came from the Rabshakeh, you remember that's where the threats were coming from, he basically sent off for Isaiah to find out what they could do. And he asked Isaiah to pray to God on Judah's behalf. And in the meantime, if you remember, Rabshakeh returned and reported back to Sennacherib on what all was being done. And this is when Sennacherib sent Rabshakeh back to Hezekiah with a letter. And that's when Hezekiah took that letter, he laid it out before the Lord, and he was basically saying, Lord, help us. What do we need to do? The glory is yours.
That's kind of like, sometimes I don't think about it, but when you are going through a lot of trouble and worry, that's exactly what Hezekiah did. He gave that worry to the Lord.
Yeah.
So sometimes I forget to do that. When I go through stuff, I need to give my worry to God, and I can trust that He's going to take care of it.
Well, would that not go along with what Jesus taught about us worrying about tomorrow? Yeah.
And that was just a beautiful way that Hezekiah did that. Took that to the Lord.
Yeah. He didn't try to take it into his own hands, but he just threw it all out there saying, God, help me. So yeah, you're right. And that's what Jesus teaches us to do. Don't be worrying about tomorrow. Focus on yourself today. Keep faithful. Pray to God. God's going to take care of you. Whatever events may happen, God will ultimately take care of you. So, yeah, that was a good point. So he laid out this letter to the Lord, and basically back in verses 33 through 35, we basically have an assurance that the king of Assyria was not going to come down against Jerusalem because God was not going to allow that to happen. So Hezekiah is already seeing God's getting involved He heard the prayers. He sees what's going on, and he's saying, no, Sennacherib's not going to accomplish that. He's going to go back to his own land, and, well, we see ultimately he ended up getting assassinated by his own children. So as we look at this and we look at prayer and how we should pray, we do have some points that we can learn from here, just like Jesus gave us some points on the model prayer of how we should go to God in prayer. But one thing is we can pray with an assurance and an appreciation that God knows all things. He knows what we need before we ever pray for it. We go to God in prayer, and sometimes we may think, well, God doesn't know about this. God knows everything that's going on. But he still wants you to go to him, that you can show him the honor and glory, and knowing that you have full faith in him, that he's the all-powerful God. And we're coming to him humbled and asking for help. And that's exactly what took place here. God knows all. Pray with confidence in God's faithfulness that he will protect his own people. Pray with his glory in mind. To God be the glory. And all of this is examples for us that we can look at, just like you said, Shannon. Just lay it all out. Lay the worries out before God. So a lot of times we don't go to the Old Testament, but we have to keep in mind that the Old Testament is here for our learning, and we can get instructions from it. We can get examples from it.
Romans 15:4.
That's right. And we'll end class by reading Romans 15. So going through the book of Isaiah helps us today and being able to see these things and learn from them. So in Romans 15 and verse 4, it says, "For whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope." We can take that same hope that we're reading about here and be able to apply it to us today, and that we have hope if only we stay faithful to God. So that's all I've got for chapter 37, unless anybody else has got something they want to add. And if not, then we'll say class is dismissed.